Hi, my name is Emma Lansdowne. I am a horticulturalist from Victoria, BC, currently on maternity leave with my month-old son, so I apologize for any crying or gurgling that might be in the background of this recording. I would like to acknowledge before beginning my talk that I live and work as a visitor on the traditional territory of the Wasanic, Lekwungen, and Wyoming peoples of the Coast Salish nations. This paper examines the use of invasive species terminology in ecological debates over the trans-regional movement of flora in light of current scientific research documenting various modes of consciousness, communication, agency, and self-awareness among plants. In considering the implications of such research for human understandings of plant consciousness, this paper aims to deconstruct the relationship between humans and plants in a way that allows for a reimagining of the concepts of consciousness and agency that rejects a strictly anthropocentric lens and provokes consideration of the impact of human hegemonic ecological practices on plant agency. The language of invasion inflects social, cultural, political, and environmental practices in ways that legitimize the hegemonic position of humans within our planetary ecosystem. Framed in terms of belonging and non-belonging, invasion terminology supports an anthropogenic notion of nature that imagines and valorizes the pre-existence and possible recreation of a true, quote, wilderness that lies in stark contrast to the anti-wilderness created by human activity. Working in conjunction with this notion is the apocalyptic imaginary, a method of thinking that embraces the inevitability of ruin and devastation heralded by the destruction of ecosystems. The reimagined past makes implicit a destructive present and a damaged future. Therefore, invasion becomes both apocalyptic and nostalgic. In the face of a climatic apocalypse, the recreation of, quote, authentic, unquote, ecosystems is a process of wilderness construction that serves to reinforce our human authority through the authoring of natural space. Our inability or unwillingness to reimagine consciousness and agency in non-human ways works in tandem with our desire for control through an ecological discourse of conquest and encroachment. This discourse simultaneously acknowledges and disregards plant agency in order to legitimate both the destructive threat of alien flora and the power of humans to determine processes of inclusion and exclusion. By labeling plants as invasive, we attribute to them the agentic power to illegally cross human-constructed boundaries, cloaking them in culpability. Yet our refusal to consider the right of plants or any other non-human agent to move, settle, and/or relocate according to the forms of consciousness, choice, or need that we cannot fully understand is a wholesale dismissal of that same agentic power of which we accuse them in their offensive trespass. The settler colonial institutions that have sought to undermine indigenous presence and power for 5 centuries are paralleled on a planetary scale as humans continue to rely on an anthropocentric understanding of the environment that, bolstered by the rhetoric of invasion, places them at the top of an ecological hierarchy. This paper will provide a brief overview of current scientific understandings of plant communication, consciousness, and agency. It will then discuss invasion terminology in relation to the movement of so-called alien flora across the globe, placing this terminology within the framework of the apocalyptic imaginary and human attempts to author ecosystems according to what Fred Pierce terms the myth of the pristine. I will conclude this paper with a discussion of the potential impacts of new understandings of plant communication and consciousness on the human response to the transmigration of alien flora and our conceptualization of human hegemony over non-human species. Scientific acknowledgement of plant communication, although now well established, has been slow to arrive and still faces many obstacles in the form of unanswered questions. The complexities of plant behavior have been recognized and documented, albeit from a distinctly non-agenic perspective, since at least the late 19th century. But early descriptions of plant communication pre-1990 were roundly dismissed as a non-existent phenomenon that could be explained by other means. However, later experiments and research have convincingly proven that plant communication through various forms of both inter- and extra-species signaling does in fact exist. Yet, despite decades of research, the behavior of plants has been largely considered less complex than that of their animal counterparts, resulting in long-term denial of the potential for differing forms of plant consciousness. Recent findings suggest quite the contrary, revealing, quote, high levels of sophistication previously thought to be within the sole domain of animal behavior, unquote. To name a few of their more impressive tendencies, plants demonstrate the ability to process information, problem solve, and make choices that are to their direct benefit. For example, in order to optimize the productivity of the strongest branches, plants consistently make comparative assessments to decide which branches will be rewarded with the greater amount of resources. They show highly complex levels of self-organization. They act with spontaneity, demonstrating the ability to control their own behavior. They show a capacity for learning from experience and for correcting errors both in their own and future generations, seen, for example, in the ability of twining plants such as the potato vine to unwind themselves from unsuitable supports and redirect towards something more appropriate. They demonstrate both self-awareness and awareness of non-native plant species, as well as predator species and mutualists, the latter being organisms of different species who exist in a reciprocally beneficial and cooperative relationship. And some plant scientists, such as Holopainen, Bland, Kikuta et al., and Carbon et al., have argued that the volatile cues they use to communicate with each other and other species, such as pollinators like bees, can be read as a form of plant language, in which individual volatile cues are words, and the volatile organic compound signature can be understood as a full sentence. While I could spend the rest of my allotted time offering innumerable examples of plants' amazing abilities, I would instead like to emphasize that the most significant question here, in light of this research, is whether intelligent behavior in plants, exemplified by these communication cues among other things, indicates a form of cognition or consciousness. Here we see a growing tide among plant scientists of support for the notion of plant cognition and consciousness. In a 2016 article on plant intelligence, cognition, and language, Cherwavas defines intelligence as the ability of an individual to both interact with its environment in ways that meet some beneficial goal or objective and adapt to different objectives and environments. Using this definition, he argues that plants more than meet this set of criteria. He also defines consciousness as a basic awareness of the outside world, and with that, he argues, comes self-awareness or self-recognition. Cherwavas asserts that plants do display consciousness, but that, unlike the more centralized form of consciousness found in the animal brain, plant consciousness is, quote, not localized but shared throughout the plant, unquote. Cherwavas, among others, lays out a clear argument for plant cognition by detailing plants' ability to make informed choices geared to optimize fitness, to act spontaneously, to learn from experience, and to correct errors. What I find of most value here, however, is that his research challenges human notions of consciousness by arguing against the criterion of a top-down centralized brain structure. In other words, his work disrupts the anthropocentric hierarchy of intelligence upon which scientific research has come to rely, by suggesting that cognition and consciousness, though thought to be limited to animals and mammals, may simply take different forms that we as humans are not yet capable of fully understanding. Until quite recently, intelligence was measured according to what Jennifer Ackerman calls, quote, human yardsticks, unquote. Placing ourselves at the top of an intelligence hierarchy, we have worked from the biased assumption that cognitive abilities in non-human species can be understood only in comparison with our own, or at the very least with other primates. The mammalian brain has been considered top brass, and the human brain, intelligence royalty. This bias in favor of the human is beginning to be undermined by new generations of researchers who question the accuracy and value of this outmoded way of thinking. The now burgeoning field of animal studies has provided a useful framework for such inquiry and may continue to be useful for plant scientists moving forward. However, the concept of human exceptionalism is by no means vanquished. In fact, in this age of the Anthropocene, one could argue that it is as central to our understanding of ourselves in relation to the rest of the planet than ever before. The value we have placed on human intelligence and, consequently, our assumed superior function in the world is due not only to an inability, but in fact an unwillingness to reimagine concepts such as intelligence, consciousness, and agency in non-human ways, for to do so would be to undermine our human authority and our hegemonic position on the planet. This need to retain our human authority stems largely from a desire for security, pointing to wide-ranging anthropocentric fears regarding place and belonging. It is here that I want to connect back to the notion of invasive species and the militaristic language that is almost exclusively used to describe the transmigration of alien flora and fauna. The latest advances in plant research, as discussed above, present an opportunity for a re-evaluation of the relationship between humans and plants, seen most poignantly through the lens of invasive species. As Fred Pearce's grounding book, The New Wild, has shown us, invasion terminology abounds in discussions of migratory species. Pearce suggests that this antagonistic approach to the global movement of flora and fauna inevitably grew out of the development of our modern understanding of ecosystems as, quote, tightly knit associations of species that had evolved together to create a unified whole, unquote. The conceptualization of ecosystems as inward-looking networks of mutually responsive species easily works to frame alien species as potentially dangerous trespassers. In the mid-20th century, ecologist Charles Elton published The Ecology of Invasions of Animals and Plants, which, though not the first to use militaristic language to describe alien species, became a foundational text in a new wave of environmental thinking of the 1960s. The work of Elton and others spawned a new field of invasion biology, and rather becoming more measured, the language applied to alien species has maintained its overwrought militaristic edge. As Pearce succinctly puts it, quote, such excited language, replete with military and xenophobic metaphors, has continued to feature in the everyday discourse of scientists investigating alien species, and even in their research papers. It may not sound very dispassionate or scientific, but it reflects the assumption that foreign species are up to no good, and that their alienness means their impacts can be assumed to be bad. They are guilty until proven innocent, unquote. Pearce makes clear that scientific inquiry is not immune to emotional bias, but I would like to put his point into a larger sociocultural framework by suggesting that the use of invasion terminology goes beyond the insular world of invasion biologists, and in fact reflects what many perceive to be a fading of borders, imagined or otherwise. In an increasingly globalized world fraught with social, economic, political, and military conflict, the language of threatened security is a response to the perceived penetrability of human-constructed boundaries. This conceptualization of a world vulnerable to foreign trespass, human and non-human alike, frames migration as a global crisis, reaffirming place-based fears and legitimating xenophobic attitudes and policies. It is also evidence of what urban geographer Ash Amin identifies as the apocalyptic imaginary, writing that, quote, by design or default, it draws a parallel between diverse threats, seeing them as perturbations of a world system on the edge of breakdown, unquote. Connecting human migration to the cross-border movement of flora and fauna through a shared discourse of invasion fuels the perceived conflagration of multiple crises that contributes to the notion of a damaged future. As many, including Pearce, have noted, this conflation of human and non-human migration through invasion terminology has occurred in previous periods of intense international political tension. But this fact does not diminish its power today. While I do not suggest that invasion biologists or so-called nativists are xenophobic per se, the shared discourse bolsters the power of both arguments and contributes to our apocalyptic imaginary. In the current global political catastrophe-ridden climate, the fight against migration of humans and non-humans has gained renewed vigor, and the interlacing of these ideas is becoming more blatant and more frequent. Whether in the case of human or non-human agents, the use of invasion terminology as a construction of crisis indicates an associative link between security, space, and identity, suggesting that processes of placemaking and placekeeping are part of an everyday practice of identity construction and preservation. Placemaking is a process of imagined and real spatial ordering in which we, as architects, construct simultaneously our collective space and self. For example, environmental historian Peter Coates holds that the creation of a national identity is inextricably linked to a valorization of so-called native nature. The legitimization of a naturalized patrimony, he argues, is based on, quote, symbiotic processes of identification and rejection, unquote, that create, quote, a nature of inclusion and a nature of exclusion by distinguishing between native species and those that fall beyond the pale, unquote. These processes, according to Coates, spring from initial periods of enthusiasm for intercontinental transplantation that are ultimately rejected, creating a controversy that is framed in terms of, quote, immigrant promise and desirability and immigrant menace and undesirability, unquote. The rejection of non-native species of flora and fauna and the creation of a legitimate national identity illustrates the vital role of landscape in Western understandings of belonging and non-belonging. Here, spatial planning works on behalf of the dominant political agenda, and control of the natural landscape is a means to control any aspect of human nature, or indeed any human, deemed to be potentially revolutionary and therefore dangerous. Coates's argument offers an opportunity to consider the ways in which the perpetuation of settler colonial practices and institutions depends upon framing national identity through the appropriation and construction of so-called native spaces and the rejection of alien species. Such rejection is made most effective through a security framework in which militaristic language becomes a form of discursive violence that buttresses systemic and institutionalized racism. Invasion, the primary mechanism of conquest, is co-opted into the national discourse of the settler colonial state in order to legitimate colonial hegemonic belonging. The intersection of appropriated nativeness and the fear-mongering discourse of invasion serves to rewrite settler colonial history through the reimagining of a utopian pre-contact past in which the settler colonizers are written in as the legitimate inhabitants. The co-option of exotic or invasive species of flora and fauna into the rhetoric of invasiveness supports this rewriting through the construction of a narrative of pristine wilderness untouched by humans, which actively excludes and therefore makes invisible the indigenous inhabitants of colonized lands. In doing so, colonial settlers are reframed as the legitimate native population. While this rewriting of colonial history perpetuates settler colonial hegemony, it may also be read as a legitimization of the hegemonic position of humans within our planetary ecosystem. Like colonial constructions of native spaces and reimaginings of a utopic pre-contact past, invasion terminology as applied to alien flora serves to imagine a pre-human pristine wilderness that we have sought to destroy through our poor management practices. Within this myth of the pristine, to use Peirce's words, is embedded a deep nostalgia for a prehistoric landscape free from human intervention that has not existed for millennia. In this apocalyptic imaginary, we seem to be left with little choice but to try to undo some of the damage we have wrought across the globe by ridding ecosystems of the pestilence of foreign invaders and righting the balance of nature. In effect, we attempt to recreate a non-human utopia through the human construction or reconstruction of ecosystems, and this insistent authoring of space, this endless creation of seemingly secure boundaries, reinforces our human authority over the globe. We are the authors of our disastrous future, and we believe ourselves to be the only ones capable of rewriting that future. The problem with this approach is twofold. First, the notion of a pristine, pre-human natural landscape is flawed, ignoring as it does, quote, the longevity and extent of our influence, unquote. Second, it turns out that our understanding of ecosystems as embodying a natural order and balance is equally flawed. Nature is imbalanced and in a constant state of evolution. The established systems theory of nature reflects our own desire for security through placemaking, yet much like the perceived conflagration of crises embodied in the apocalyptic imaginary, nature and evolution in fact embrace chaos. Our authoring of ecosystems, our so-called recreation of native spaces, bolsters our hegemonic position on the planet while simultaneously preserving a sense of security in the face of current and future climatic disaster. Our arrogance in believing that we can right the perceived imbalances of nature through the construction of arbitrary boundaries and the direct rejection of alien species also reiterates belief in our superior human intelligence. As I mentioned before, the militaristic discourse of invasion biology rests on a contradiction in which alien species, in our case flora, are ascribed agency through our perception of their active transgressive encroachment upon so-called native environments, yet are denied agentic abilities in the form of consciousness and cognition. For this reason, we deny them the right to successfully settle in new regions regardless of when, how, or why they arrived, or what little damage they may have actually inflicted on native species. Peirce argues that invasion biology is founded upon a fundamentally misguided presumption that all alien species are inherently harm-inducing and havoc-wreaking. This has led to biased research that relies solely on the study of known troublemakers among alien flora and fauna, such as zebra mussels or kudzu vine, pictured here, ignoring those species whose effects are either unknown or known to be benign. The result of this, Pierce remarks, is, quote, scientific myth-making, unquote. I am easily persuaded by Pierce's argument, but like before, I'd like to take his myth-making beyond the context of invasion biology to point out that flawed thinking about the dangers of alien species begins with the most basic premise of boundaries. This paper is an investigation into the framing of migratory flora as invasive in light of new scientific research that points to differing forms of consciousness, communication, and agency among plant species. An investigation that admittedly offers few conclusions and instead a plethora of questions that pave the way for further research. In evaluating our arguably flawed sense of human authority over non-human species, I question the legitimacy of our exclusionary framing of natural spaces in terms of belonging and non-belonging, as well as whether the notion of plant rights should be considered alongside those of animals. And finally, I ask what effect these new understandings of plant consciousness and agency might have on invasion biology, the cultural political climate of environmental protection and invasive species, and human hegemony across the globe. While the planet is made up by countless, often unique ecosystems, the notion of distinct boundaries is in fact a human construction that serves a wider agenda of placemaking. The conventional understanding of ecosystems as mutually supportive, balanced, and inherently closed systems of nature serves our wider desire for barriers that serve not only a spatial but political and socio-cultural purpose. In thinking about the wholesale labeling of species as alien or native or invasive or non-invasive, it behooves us to ask who determines what or who is invasive or non-invasive, and by extension, what or who is included or excluded in formations of space and place. As planetary leaders, we have, as humans, granted ourselves the right to determine who or what belongs. Yet scientific research on plant and animal intelligence questions the value and justice of our claim. But while animal studies has made great strides towards the establishment of animal rights and a questioning of our human authority over non-human species, plant studies remains, in essence, in infancy. Knowing the conclusions Terwavis, Carbon, Holopainen, and others have drawn in their research into plant cognition and consciousness, can space justifiably be made for a similar conversation about plant rights? Working from the assumption that plants do indeed display consciousness and agency, albeit in ways that are difficult or impossible for us yet to understand, what implications do such conclusions have for invasion biology and the wider cultural and political rhetoric of invasive species, as well as for our own human hegemonic self-image? While I do not pretend to have the answers to all these questions, I would like to leave you with a brief discussion of Andrew Pickering's Dances of Agency as a potential way to reframe notions of intelligence, cognition, and consciousness away from human exceptionalism and towards a non-anthropocentric understanding of the environment. Moving away from what he calls the linguistic turn of human and social sciences in the second half of the 20th century, Pickering seeks a more performative or practical approach to the material world, one in which scientific engagement with the material world becomes a, quote, temporally extended back and forth dance of human and non-human agency, in which activity and passivity on both sides are reciprocally intertwined, unquote. Within this framework, Pickering sees the potential for agency in humans and non-humans alike, in the sense that agency is derived from any action that makes a difference to others. For him, this performance of agency is both unpredictable, which undermines our desire for a predictive and causal universe, and decentered, so that these dances of agency, quote, cannot be accounted for by focusing either on the human or non-human alone, unquote. In other words, rather than being either human or non-human, they are, quote, zones of intersection where the non-human world enters constitutively into the becoming of the human world, and vice versa, unquote. More importantly, the dance doesn't have to include humans at all. I love the imagery of a dance between two equal entities in the world. As tempting as it is to fall into an anti-human rhetoric that dreams of a planet better off because we have extinguished ourselves, at this point at least, that is an unrealistic proposition. But so too is the tired claim to human superiority. Our intelligence as humans does not give us greater claim to value than, for example, a tree. If we are honest, the tree probably does greater good for its surrounding environment than any impact we make on the world, and certainly it is far less destructive. Pickering's theory becomes useful in pointing out the imbalanced relationships that are constructed by humans with their environments. He argues that man's struggle to control nature should be understood as a series of enormous dances between human and non-human agency, emergent in their unpredictability and often unending due to our insistence on a hegemonic approach to environmental management, in the face of nature's refusal to docilely submit to our command. This approach, based fundamentally on the notion of human exceptionalism, Pickering argues, impoverishes us in action and thought because it assumes that we always already know ourselves and the world. Embracing a less predictive, emergent framework for understanding the world and our place in it would be more enriching and far more illuminating. Allowing for the notion of non-human agency opens space for questions about the morality or malignancy of the transmigration of flora and fauna across the globe. It also opens the door for a reimagining of non-human consciousness. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the organizers of this wonderful conference. I look forward to engaging in further discussion in the comments section below.